Jackson is the capital of the state of Mississippi, close to 200,000 people. 80% of the city is black, overwhelmingly working class, overwhelmingly impoverished.
We're dealing with generations of mindset of slavery, what I call post-slavery syndrome. There are things that happen to us historically that has been passed through generations and it hasn't stopped.
The Trump phenomenon is catching many people throughout the world by storm. Mississippi's been living with that since the Redeemer Constitution government of the 1890s in one form or another.
Something has to be done, and I think Cooperation Jackson is a good vehicle to help with that.
What Cooperation Jackson is trying to do, preserve the land, build economic basis about collective resources, creating the commons, and creating new social relationships. That's the core essence of what our program is about.
With the Jackson Cush plan, written over a decade ago, one of the things that was initiated through that plan was the idea of taking back the means of production for the working class here in Jackson, heart of the Black Belt South.
What we're building here is something called a solidarity economy, systems where we're doing work that's meaningful to us and where we can feel like we have ownership of our labor.
Let's focus on the transition of value. If I fix something for you, you may not have to pay it. It means you could do some child care for me.
That you have something of value, whether you have no money at all or if you do have a job.
We have the Jackson Just Transition Plan, making Jackson a zero waste and zero emission city.
What really made the civil rights movement strong is that people really checked for each other. They really cared about one another. They ate together, they fought together, they cried together, they bled together. All of that is definitely going to be needed because that's how we have been able to survive and be able to be resilient through all of this.
How do we build our own economic base and build it on an anti-capitalist basis? We need to take the limited resource we have and then prioritize around need. Mississippi currently is 60% white, roughly, and 40% black. After Reconstruction, this was a majority black state, and it only transitioned from being a majority black state within the last 70 years, and that had some profound political consequences. Right before the Civil War, this was the richest state within the Union. How that wealth was accumulated was chattel slavery and the byproducts of chattel slavery. Cotton and other cash crops. A lot of that accumulated wealth was also in timber. Enslaved Africans clear-cutting the old growth forest in order to create the cash crop economy. That timber wound up being used in the British fleet. Chattel slavery was concentrated in the western portion of the state, and the eastern portion was largely white working class folks. The only thing that they could afford oftentimes was the poorer lands that the big planters didn't want, couldn't use. So most of the eastern part of the state is white, most of the western part of the state is black. Now that creates a political division within the state that still exists to this day. Because of gerrymandering in the 90s, Mississippi now has a Republican supermajority state legislature, and that actually got taken over by the Tea Party. So the Tea Party actually runs the state of Mississippi, not your old school Republican, and even that is now being redefined actively by Trump's rearticulation of the party. Now, Mississippi is the poorest state in the Union. Still primarily an agricultural-based state, but the dominant thing is, once again, trees. It's the descendants of that initial planter class, the few rich white families who owns and controls the means of production here. And they still run things in such a manner that still to this day, they use open forms of white supremacist populism to galvanize the majority of white working class around supporting a politics that only really benefits a small few. To our immediate east is Rankin County, majority white, where some of the most openly racist politicians live. The Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nation live there. The social aspect of white supremacy is that even though you might be as poor as hell, you're still better than this black person, you're still better than that immigrant. When Trump went to the wall in Texas to announce his campaign, the immediate thing that it brought to mind, Ronald Reagan announced his 1979-80 presidential campaign right here in Mississippi by going to the city where Emmett Till was lynched. In many respects, Emmett Till's murder was the birth of the more militant, modern, quote-unquote, civil rights movement. His mother having the courage to bring in the media and open that casket up. It exposed the United States on an international level, but from a conservative, reactionary place, it's the start of what made America degenerate, what weakened it. So Trump knew that. Not only does he make his announcement, but he comes out with that stupid little hat, with that basic campaign, you know, make America great again. You know, a lot of people laughed at it, but to a lot of people who feel like America's the greatest thing since sliced bread, they've been taught that all their life, and they feel like they've been losing out. People didn't understand how deeply that resonated to a certain sector of folks.
Now, you got to know something about Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was not a man running around talking about no nonviolence. Don't throw no nonviolence on Medgar. Medgar was willing to take it to the line if he had to. He didn't go around talking violence, but if he had to take it to the line, but you better believe he was well organized and well prepared, and he had tier levels of men prepared to do the work that needed to be done.
This narrative that 54 was something new, it was actually picking up the torch and a younger generation overcoming the fear of the repression that happened a decade earlier. Medgar Evers, the folks that were his key infrastructure, were all radical labor organizers from the 1930s.
If the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America?
For us in the United States, you know, this fight against white supremacy is a central one. And to think that you could just somehow institute an egalitarian society without dealing the issue of race is actually going to repeat a lot of the mistakes. Land redistribution after the Civil War was betrayed. That basically locked Black people into a new form of enslavement. The initial degree of Black land ownership in this context was largely children produced from rape. Their fathers granted their children acres of land, often cases some choice productive land. That is one of the primary reasons groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White Knights formed, was to remove Black folks off the land. What emerges from that is a serious quest from the end of slavery to the present of a Black demand for land. Having something of your own that the night riders can't come and take, having something where you can grow your own food and not be dependent upon the market, that's very deep in Black culture.
I was arrested. I was 19 years old. We were the first Waco. The New Bethel incident, when the police came in, the Detroit police came in there to try to shoot up. Everybody in that church, men, women, and children, were having a peaceful demonstration to try to kill them. They were shooting under the pews. They were shooting at little children running and crying.
Having lived through COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, watching the FBI hunt members of your family and kick down doors. Most of COINTELPRO was actually not on the books. It was actually illegal by law. Patriot Act made that all legal and then some. Within Malcolm X grassroots movement and New African People's Organizations, we sat down and said, you know, we are likely going to be targeted as a terrorist organization or organization that has some terrorist links because of our history relative to some of the political prisoners and prisoners of war who were inside, were part of the New African Independence movement. And then we just said, look, we can't keep doing some things in the same way. So a study group emerged out of that. That wound up over a period of time leading to the Jackson Kush Plan. The People's Assembly existed before the plan. That's one thing everybody should know. That component we see as the lead component of the Jackson Kush Plan, and then the other two pillars, you know, the independent electoral politics and the building the solidarity economy, are really, in some respects, we see them as outgrowths of that core component. Rightly or wrongly, we kind of tried to focus strategically on doing the electoral politics out of the assembly. Chokwe's election was a major disruption to a concerted plan of gentrification. Folks knew him from his law practice, doing capital murder cases and cases that nobody else would take pro bono, and doing that for decades. He brought out 20,000 working class voters who don't normally show up. The initial strategy was we would get in office and then we would change the policy infrastructure within the city that would then enable a vehicle like Cooperation Jackson to be born. On the 24th, February, Chokwe dies. I can remember being in office. I had talked to him earlier that day about a presentation, and I knew he was in the hospital, but he was not a man who thought his life was in danger. He was still working. And so, you know, an entire movement just being kind of in shock, you know, like this was not in the plans. There was a special election. His son ran in that election. He lost by a thin margin. He was young, and he didn't have the track record that his father had. I think the other factor, we didn't do everything with a mass orientation, and that was a mistake. There was no explanation for certain decisions. They just happened. As far as most people are concerned, it was like same old, same old. Y'all just like everybody else. If I had to do it all over again, I would have pushed more for us doing the solidarity economy work before getting into the electoral politics. And I think in all honesty, we did the electoral politics because that's what we knew how to do. I think we should have gotten out of our comfort zone, build that base up, build a new set of transformative relationships up, and then went for that. We thought it was very important that we demonstrate first and foremost that the actual movement was not dependent solely on electoral politics, and was definitely not dependent on one individual. Through the vehicle of the Jackson Rising Conference, which was held in May 2014, we put the basic core committee that created Cooperation Jackson from that theory, mind you, of the Jackson Kush Plan, and then tried to put that theory into practice. We are deliberately trying to make it as mass as possible to include particularly younger white workers who we are trying to draw and attract into our mix to work on developing the solidarity economy, and then take that to the eastern portions of the state. Now, embedded in that was this notion of taking the solidarity economy, taking particularly co-ops, worker co-ops. There was a history of cooperative experiments in the city and in the region. Most of the black farmers only survived by having very formal cooperative structures.
So some of the co-ops that we have are, you know, the Cafe, Freedom Farms, and Community Production Center, as well as the Green Team. And through those cooperatives, those who are members of that cooperative are not only members of the cooperative, but they have financial ownership in that as well.